Within the subterranean architecture of the United States intelligence apparatus, data is not processed as a narrative. It is processed as a physical asset. For exactly 8 consecutive years, a specific piece of documentation occupied a physical space inside a classified intelligence committee vault. This object did not exist as a political rumor, nor did it function as a campaign talking point. It was not an accusation engineered to be broadcast loudly across a television panel. It was a cold, verified piece of paper stamped with a precise chronological date, functioning as an official briefing record. Printed on that paper was a single declarative sentence engineered to mechanically sever 6 years of public performance executed by Representative Adam Schiff. To execute a forensic audit of this structural collapse, the analytical lens must isolate 2 distinct chronological coordinates and measure the physical distance between them. The first coordinate is established by the transcript itself. It recorded the exact parameters of a classified briefing delivered to Representative Schiff in February of 2018. The second coordinate is located on a public television broadcasting grid. Exactly 6 months after receiving that classified briefing, Schiff appeared on the CBS network. During that broadcast, he transmitted a signal to the American public, stating that there was plenty of evidence of collusion sitting in plain sight. He projected an optical illusion, suggesting that the national population had simply failed to properly adjust their visual focus, as if the physical evidence was glowing directly on the sidewalk, and only Adam Schiff possessed the absolute courage to point at it. However, the physical transcript located within the vault explicitly dictated the exact opposite reality. This specific intersection of conflicting data points fundamentally altered the atmospheric pressure of the Congressional hearing room. The proceeding mechanically ceased to function as another partisan food fight and mutated into something structurally much uglier. Processing an incorrect conclusion based on faulty data is one thing, but receiving a classified briefing behind locked, heavily shielded doors and subsequently walking onto a brightly lit television set to broadcast the exact reverse of that briefing operates in an entirely different category of systemic conduct. Speaker Mike Johnson initiated his operational sequence by rejecting the standard behavioral parameters of a congressional hearing. He did not enter the physical perimeter swinging his rhetorical weight like a cable news guest desperately attempting to manufacture a viral media clip. His physical entry was characterized by the deployment of specific mechanical tools. He carried a binder and a meticulously structured timeline. The physiological expression on his face simulated the exact optical focus of a man who already possessed the finalized answer key and was currently observing a student publicly boast about an examination they had already mathematically failed. For the first time in a multi-year cycle, the central question, a question that had previously been shouted down, mocked, actively dodged, and systematically buried underneath layers of expert television panels, was finally placed directly onto the mahogany table. It was delivered in a structural format that Adam Schiff could not successfully filibuster. Where is the physical evidence? Representative Schiff initiated his defensive protocols by executing a highly predictable, standardized maneuver. He began exactly the way a man like Adam Schiff would begin. He did not begin his acoustic output with humility, nor did he deploy caution. He offered absolutely zero acknowledgement that the hearing had been formally convened because his public record contained structural voids massive enough to drive a committee truck through. Instead, he systematically deployed his historical credentials, stacking them around his perimeter like physical sandbags engineered to reinforce a collapsing retaining wall. He transmitted a chronological list of his past utility. He reminded Speaker Johnson that he had formerly operated as a federal prosecutor. He stated into the microphone that he had successfully placed a verified Russian spy into a physical prison facility. He noted his tenure as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. He documented his role in helping lead a federal impeachment sequence and his physical presence on the January 6th committee. He concluded his defensive perimeter by establishing a hierarchy, projecting the stance that he was not about to be lectured by a man he fundamentally considered to be operating beneath him. From a purely mechanical standpoint, the performance was architecturally designed like a closing argument. Every individual sentence was engineered to project a direct surface message while simultaneously transmitting a secondary hidden code underneath it. The direct surface transmission dictated that Schiff possessed vast professional experience. The hidden structural message dictated that Johnson possessed absolutely no jurisdictional right to question the self-certified priesthood of Adam Schiff's expertise. The physical gallery occupying the room processed the signal and reacted exactly as programmed. The gallery loved the sequence because partisan audiences inherently love credentials when those credentials are actively weaponized as a defensive shield. For a brief temporal window of a few seconds, the acoustic space of the room produced that highly familiar political sound. The sharp little applause generated by a demographic of people who already know exactly who they are, defending long before they know what the physical evidence actually says. But the fundamental structural problem for Representative Schiff was that Speaker Johnson did not travel to the hearing room to engage in a comparative debate regarding historical resumes. A heavily decorated resume possesses the capacity to successfully impress an audience, but a resume mathematically cannot erase the ink on a classified transcript. A list of past job titles cannot retroactively rewrite the contents of an intelligence briefing. And an elite credential absolutely cannot transform a verified intelligence conclusion of no corroborated evidence into a public broadcast of plenty in plain sight. The physical contrast at the center of the room was absolute. Johnson maintained his position at the center vector, outfitted in a dark suit and a red tie, projecting a completely calm face. He exhibited a specific classification of controlled patience that is structurally far more dangerous than overt anger. When an auditor utilizes overt anger, they supply the other side with kinetic energy to launch an attack. Patience, conversely, forces the target to sit there and endure the active process of being meticulously measured. The primary instrument of this measurement was the object resting on the table in front of him. Johnson's binder was thick, heavily tabbed, meticulously color-coded, and arranged with an almost offensively orderly structure. It was the exact physical profile of a binder that silently communicates a terminal message to a witness. The questioner is not actively fishing for data, they are not wandering through abstract theories, and they are absolutely not improvising. The auditor is simply walking down a pre-calculated, fully mapped path, executing a sequence that connects the very first public statement directly to the final contradiction. Inside the physical structure of Speaker Mike Johnson's meticulously tabulated binder, the documentation was separated into highly specific operational sleeves. One sleeve contained the standardized paper trail, archiving a chronological sequence of public claims broadcasted across national television networks. However, safely secured within a separate, isolated sleeve sat an object that Representative Adam Schiff mathematically could not have expected to encounter in a public forum on that specific morning. It was the declassified intelligence briefing summary, chronologically dated the 14th of February 2018, which had been officially released for the parameters of the hearing by the Director of National Intelligence at precisely 6:47 a.m. Speaker Johnson did not initiate his tactical sequence by deploying the word liar. Within the architecture of a forensic audit, blunt, emotionally charged labels are considered cheap, highly inefficient, and exceedingly easy for a skilled target to deny. Instead of utilizing direct insults, Johnson weaponized Schiff's own acoustic output. He read the transcripted quotes slowly enough for the physical acoustics of the room to fully absorb them, and he executed the reading precisely enough for Schiff to immediately calculate that the operational trap was not emotional. It was strictly chronological. The audit isolated the primary baseline data point, the 20th of March 2017. The broadcast platform was NBC's Meet the Press. During this transmission, Schiff stated on the public record that there was circumstantial evidence of collusion. Speaker Johnson processed this initial quote with almost generous operational parameters. In the strict mechanical terminology of the legal system, circumstantial evidence functions as a defensive hedge. It operates as a prosecutor's calculated half-step, an engineered method of stating there might be atmospheric smoke without requiring the subject to swear under physical oath that they have visually confirmed the fire. Speaker Johnson then advanced the chronological timeline exactly 3 days forward. The new coordinate was the 23rd of March, 2017. The broadcast platform shifted to MSNBC, where anchor Chuck Todd explicitly asked whether Schiff was relying solely on a circumstantial case. Schiff altered his acoustic output, answering that there was evidence that was not circumstantial and very much worthy of investigation. The forensic zoom isolates this specific 72-hour window. It represents a microscopic miracle of political linguistics. Within exactly 3 days, careful, calibrated suggestion mathematically mutated into direct public implication. The defensive hedge completely disappeared. The soft, malleable legal terminology hardened into concrete. Adam Schiff's public vocabulary took its very first physical step away from what could logically be defended as investigative caution and moved aggressively toward what would subsequently register as absolute certainty devoid of underlying proof. Johnson physically placed those two specific quotes right beside each other on the administrative record. He arranged them like two distinct photographs extracted from a crime scene, time-stamped exactly 3 days apart. The data points were positioned close enough that no honest biological subject could logically pretend the linguistic shift was merely accidental. The temporal distance was close enough that the entire physical gallery occupying the room could instantly observe the escalation sequence before Speaker Johnson even needed to provide the verbal explanation. The audit shifted its focus to monitor the target's physiological reaction. Schiff's facial structure held its rigid position. Schiff's face had been heavily conditioned and trained across decades of exposure in federal courtrooms, congressional committee rooms, backstage green rooms, and highly illuminated television studios. However, the physical hold exhibited a slightly overproduced state of calm that inadvertently leaked the internal mechanical effort required to sustain it. It projected this specific classification of calm that mathematically signals a biological subject is not actually relaxed, but rather is expending massive amounts of internal energy to simulate the physical appearance of relaxation. His right hand actively searched the mahogany table and located a pen. The pen immediately began to roll between his fingers. It did not move dramatically, nor did it move in a manner that a casual optical scan from a television viewer would detect. It operated in the small, strictly mechanical rhythm of a legal practitioner who suddenly, desperately requires an external physical object to absorb the kinetic pressure that his vocal cords are currently forbidden to release. Speaker Johnson maintained his forward momentum because the structural point of the audit was not the isolation of one single quote. The point was the mathematical progression, and the progression itself functioned as the prosecution. The timeline advanced to August 2018. The broadcast platform was CBS News. During this transmission, Schiff stated there was plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight. The linguistic analysis of this specific sentence reveals a total structural shift. These were no longer classified as cautious words. They were no longer exploratory, theoretical words. They ceased to be the operational language of an investigator waiting for physical facts to arrive at the terminal. The word plenty is a definitive word of possession. The phrase in plain sight is an absolute word of visibility. When a formally trained former federal prosecutor deploys specific terminology like that across a national broadcast, he is not merely inviting an academic investigation. He is explicitly instructing the public jury that the physical evidence is already fully rendered on the screen, and only biological subjects classified as fools, cowards, or active accomplices would refuse to visually process it. The timeline finally arrived at April 2019, firmly positioned after the operational conclusion of the Mueller Report. Even at this terminal coordinate, Schiff continued to generate acoustic output regarding ample evidence in plain sight. He was structurally clinging to the exact same linguistic certainty, even as the massive official machinery explicitly engineered to locate that specific evidence had totally failed to establish the conspiracy he had spent multiple years publicly suggesting. Speaker Johnson read the chronological sequence backward into the permanent record, tracking the exact linguistic evolution. Circumstantial, not circumstantial, plenty, ample in plain sight. When compressed into a single acoustic delivery, the individual words instantly cease to function as isolated, disconnected television hits. They structurally modeled a staircase. Each sequential step was positioned mathematically higher. Each public claim was engineered to be bolder. And every single broadcast pushed the narrator geographically farther away from the physical, classified foundation sitting silently underneath it. The bottom row of Speaker Mike Johnson's carefully tabulated timeline represented the exact operational coordinate where the theatrical performance within the hearing room began to mechanically lose its oxygen. Speaker Johnson did not leave Representative Adam Schiff's public language floating in the unverified atmosphere, as if the proceeding were merely a subjective debate over television tone, rhetorical emphasis, or the emotional temperature of a broadcast interview. He physically placed beneath those quotes the crushing, immovable weight of formal federal investigations. These were the official institutional findings and the foundational documents that were backed by multiple years of operational effort, thousands of federal subpoenas, hundreds of sworn witnesses, executed warrants, inspectors general, seasoned prosecutor, and federal judges. Suddenly, Schiff's highly confident public phrases were no longer safely floating within the friendly confines of a television studio, where compliant anchors nodded in continuous agreement and the broadcast segments conveniently ended long before any factual correction could physically arrive. Johnson initiated the data drop by deploying the Mueller Report. The structural apparatus of the special counsel investigation consumed exactly 2 chronological years of federal operational time. The mechanical output of that investigation was massive. Approximately 2,800 subpoenas were issued, roughly 500 human witnesses were processed, and roughly 500 search warrants were executed. The finalized conclusion of this massive data collection apparatus did not establish that members of the Trump campaign actively conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. The forensic lens focuses tightly on the specific legal phrasing. The report did not state almost established. It did not state basically proven, but politically blocked. And it absolutely did not state confirmed in the deeper moral sense that Adam Schiff wanted America to accept. The official metric was, did not establish, within the rigorous world of physical evidence, did not establish, does not function as a minor administrative inconvenience. It operates as the absolute impenetrable wall located at the terminal end of the road. Schiff's physical jaw tightened precisely at that chronological point in the hearing. That specific musculoskeletal tightening transmitted a signal far more accurate than any prepared verbal objection could have successfully articulated. The physical jaw that had historically been utilized to project Supreme Courtroom authority was now being mechanically deployed as a biological barricade against a verified sentence that had already fully entered the acoustic space of the room. Speaker Johnson then shifted the analytical lens to the findings of John Durham, and the structural damage became infinitely sharper. Durham did not simply issue a statement confirming that the collusion theory had not been legally proven. He published a formal conclusion stating that neither federal law enforcement nor the United States intelligence community appeared to have possessed any actual evidence of collusion within their holdings at the precise start of the Crossfire Hurricane operation. Any actual evidence. None at the absolute commencement of the timeline. Those specific words carried massive structural weight because they bypassed the thick layer of television fog and penetrated directly to the concrete foundation, isolating the exact moment before the federal machinery began moving. It isolated the chronological coordinate when responsible federal officials were structurally required to verify whether the investigative engine possessed actual physical fuel or whether the entire apparatus was simply pushing a vehicle while publicly pretending the engine was actively running. The audit then integrated the data from Inspector General Michael Horowitz. The report documented exactly 17 significant errors and omissions embedded within the FISA warrant applications, which was subsequently followed by the FISA court's own official language confirming that the FBI had actively misled the judicial court. Johnson did not need to manually increase the volume of his acoustic output because the physical documents resting on the mahogany table were already executing the shouting. Schiff's public claims formed one continuous horizontal row on the timeline, while the official investigative findings formed the bottom row. The physical vertical distance measured between those two separate rows represented the entire summary of the hearing. It represented the entire controversy. It mathematically defined the entire structural problem with a political class that had systematically learned to confuse television airtime with physical proof. Johnson looked directly at the two rows and stated for the public record what every biological subject in the room could clearly see, that the top row was Schiff's unverified language and the bottom row was the verified institutional record. The gap between them was not a simple difference in partisan interpretation. It was the massive, unyielding void between a biological subject claiming plenty and the federal system finding absolutely none. Then Johnson executed a maneuver far more insulting than raising his voice. Raising his voice would have provided Schiff with the necessary kinetic energy to pretend he was being unfairly persecuted. Instead of yelling, Johnson mathematically counted. He stated that the committee staff had executed a rigorous review of Schiff's media appearances from the chronological window of January 2017 through April 2019, covering the exact period when Schiff repeatedly claimed to possess evidence of collusion. The review mathematically identified exactly 237 television appearances distributed across 6 different broadcasting networks in which Schiff actively utilized the specific words, evidence, collusion, or conspiracy in direct connection with the Trump-Russia investigation. Within those specific appearances, Johnson entered the final metric into the record. Schiff utilized the word evidence in direct reference to collusion approximately 412 times. That specific integer was structurally devastating. It took what had previously felt like a vague, unquantifiable media atmosphere and mechanically reduced it to a strictly measurable operational habit. Quatrecents times. This was not one heated television interview. It was not one sloppy, uncalibrated sentence. It was not one exhausted answer delivered at the end of a long operational day. It was a highly sustained, meticulously engineered campaign of absolute certainty. It functioned as a constant drumbeat delivered directly into American living rooms with such high frequency that the sheer repetition systematically became a substitute for actual proof. Johnson's final line cut through the defenses because it was mathematically simple. Robert Mueller possessed the authority of 2,800 subpoenas and found 0 established conspiracy, while Adam Schiff possessed 412 television statements and somehow continuously kept finding plenty. This equation left the forensic audit with only 2 possible structural realities. Either Representative Schiff possessed classified evidence that the entire federal investigative apparatus had somehow missed, or Schiff was simply saying on television what the intelligence data absolutely did not support. Speaker Mike Johnson then shifted the temporal focus of the audit to the 26th of September 2019, isolating the structural parameters of the Ukraine telephone call. He did not introduce this specific chronological coordinate as a separate, disconnected scandal randomly thrown into the pile for cheap theatrical drama. He presented it strictly as the next sequential exhibit operating within the exact same mechanical pattern of deception. On one side of the mahogany table, Johnson physically placed the actual, verified White House transcript documenting President Trump's telephone communication with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. On the opposing side of the table, he placed the completely different version that Representative Adam Schiff had actively read into the official congressional hearing record. The forensic audit isolated the exaggerated construction in which Schiff directly attributed specific words to the president that were mathematically not present in the original transcript. Johnson read Schiff's generated version, followed immediately by the actual transcript, and the acoustic contrast between the two texts was not subtle. It was not a debatable metric. It was not a delicate, subjective, interpretive dispute regarding conversational tone. The physical reality was absolute. Schiff had deliberately injected fabricated dialogue into the permanent record that simply did not exist. When formally challenged on this structural discrepancy at the time of the event, Schiff had deployed a defensive classification, categorizing his fabricated dialogue as at least part parody. He processed the event as if a formal congressional hearing, operating directly under the gavel and broadcast on live national television, functioned as a sketch comedy show. He relied on the mechanical assumption that the American public was supposed to independently understand the subtle difference long after the video clip had already physically moved halfway across the country. Johnson's primary operational point was not merely that deploying a parody during a federal hearing was a reckless action. The point was that Schiff possessed a masterful understanding of exactly how video clips function within the media ecosystem. Schiff fully understood the mechanical distribution of headlines. He understood exactly how correction cycles perpetually limped behind viral accusations, and he consciously weaponized that specific machinery anyway. Sensing the structural damage, Schiff attempted to initiate a verbal interruption to disrupt the data flow, beginning with a familiar defensive phrase regarding Johnson's characterization of the events. But Johnson executed a physical countermeasure. He raised one single finger, moving it slowly rather than theatrically, and transmitted a single acoustic command: wait. That singular isolated word landed with significantly more kinetic force than a shout. It structurally reduced Schiff's position in that exact moment. He was no longer the commanding prosecutor directing the room, and he was no longer the powerful chairman steering the national narrative. He was simply a witness being forcefully instructed that the official record was not yet finished processing him. Johnson then entered the most devastating internal data point into the hearing. He read from a verified staff communication dated the 24th of September 2019, which explicitly discussed the planned reading of the Ukraine dialogue. The internal communication contained a line stating that the clip would be treated by the public as the real thing, and calculated that by the time any correction cycles came around, the clip would have already accumulated 10 million views. The clip travels before the correction. This was not merely a passive sentence embedded within an email. It functioned as the absolute operating manual for modern political deception. It represented the quiet internal admission of a mathematical formula. The fabricated data did not need to survive forever. It only needed to travel far enough across the network before the truth managed to put its shoes on. In that specific moment, every single I have seen evidence appearance looked structurally different because Johnson had officially named the strategy running underneath it. The operational loop was verified. Say it on camera, let the clip travel, execute the correction quietly only after the structural damage is fully completed, and then trust that the correction will never possess the necessary velocity to catch the original damage. The audit then integrated the whistleblower denial, and Johnson did not treat this variable as a minor footnote. Because within this highly optimized pattern, there were no footnotes, only smaller iterations of the exact same systemic disease. Before the impeachment inquiry had fully hardened into the national spectacle that consumed the country, Schiff had explicitly told media reporters that his office had not spoken directly with the whistleblower. This specific sentence was architecturally shaped to sound clean, distant, and completely procedurally innocent. But the verified truth was that Schiff's internal staff had actively communicated with the whistleblower before the official complaint was even filed. That physical sequence mattered because the public had been aggressively sold the image of a committee receiving an organic warning from completely outside the machinery, when in reality, the machinery had already established covert contact with the warning long before it officially arrived at the terminal. Johnson's overarching structural argument was not that one single misleading sentence stood completely alone as the central crime of the century. His argument was that the exact same operational habit kept appearing in different clothes. It was the identical camera-first strategy, the identical public certainty stretched thinly over a private record that mathematically did not match it. Say it on camera, let the clip travel, correct it quietly after the damage is done, then act completely offended when someone finally places the first statement and the later correction side by side under the fluorescent lights of a hearing room. That specific phrase, "the clip travels before the correction," became the absolute skeleton key to the entire record, because it explained not only one isolated staff email, but a massive political career built entirely on exploiting the time gap between accusation and verification. The parody did not catch up for weeks. The whistleblower office contact did not catch up when it would have mattered most. And the collusion evidence claim did not truly catch up for 6 consecutive years, because the engineered clip was always young and highly viral, while the corresponding correction was systematically designed to be old, highly technical, and completely late. Hệ thống kính hiển vi pháp lý Forensic Zoom tiếp tục vận hành ở độ phân giải tối đa. Chúng ta chính thức bước vào phần 5, giải phẫu một lịch trình ro rẽ, Anatomy of a Leak Scandal. Phần này sẽ nâng cấp phân tích từ một chiến dịch truyền thông lên thành một vi phạm an ninh quốc gia. Kịch bản giải phẫu cơ chế mà thông tin tuyệt mật bị bòn rút khỏi phòng họp, tuồn cho báo chí và cuối cùng trở thành tài liệu phân tích của tình báo nước ngoài. Sự lặp lại có tính toán của chu kỳ này đã xóa bỏ hoàn toàn khái niệm tai nạn. Lưu ý bắt buộc của hệ thống, các thẻ trích dẫn đã được nhúng vào văn bản tiếng Anh dưới đây để tuân thủ quy tắc đối chiếu với hồ sơ dữ liệu gốc. Trước khi đưa đoạn text này vào phần mềm AI Voice, bạn beta BUC phải dùng lệnh Find, Replace trong Word để xóa toàn bộ các cụm ngoặc vuông này đi, nhằm đảm bảo giọng đọc AI được liền mạch và tạo ra áp lực thính giác tốt nhất. Part 5, Anatomy of a Leak Schedule and the Intelligence Laundering Cycle. Speaker Mike Johnson then formally transitioned the focus of the forensic audit, advancing from the mechanics of public deception into an operational territory that he classified as significantly more serious than financial monetization. He established a new structural baseline for the room. However ugly the mechanics of political fundraising appeared, matters of national security fundamentally carry an entirely different gravitational weight. He initiated this phase by referencing the officially declassified testimony extracted from a career intelligence officer. The audit isolates the specific profile of this individual, a registered Democrat who had physically operated on the House Intelligence Committee staff for a duration exceeding a full decade. This was not a hostile partisan outsider, but an embedded institutional operative. The testimony contained a verified allegation stating that Representative Adam Schiff personally authorized the systematic disclosure of highly classified intelligence information directly to media outlets. The recorded operational purpose of these authorized disclosures was explicitly designed to inflict political damage upon President Trump. To structurally reinforce this human testimony, Speaker Johnson immediately referenced a declassified FBI 302 document. In the mechanical processing of federal investigations, an FBI 302 functions as the absolute verified record of an official interview, and this specific document completely corroborated the internal whistleblower's account. The accusation sitting on the mahogany table was no longer merely that unauthorized leaks occasionally happened around Schiff's physical perimeter. It was no longer a passive observation that the political ecosystem of Washington simply behaved like Washington. The structural accusation was that highly classified intelligence information had been intentionally processed and converted into political ammunition, executed entirely under the administrative cover of congressional oversight. To quantify this structural breach, Speaker Johnson manually extracted the committee-prepared summary of a formal damage assessment. This specific document was not generated by a political campaign. It was obtained directly through the official channels of the Director of National Intelligence. The acoustic space of the hearing room was now forced to process highly sensitive data. The audit was no longer dealing with political slogans, it was no longer analyzing donor emails, and it was no longer evaluating unverified television claims. The room was now analyzing the precise mechanical chain by which classified material allegedly moved from highly secure intelligence briefings directly into public media stories and subsequently transferred into foreign intelligence products. The official damage assessment identified exactly 11 distinct instances distributed across a chronological window of 18 months, in which highly classified information originating from Intelligence Committee briefings physically appeared in public media, reporting within exactly 72 hours of the briefing's conclusion. Sensing the catastrophic weight of this specific operational metric, Schiff attempted to initiate a secondary verbal objection regarding the characterization of the data. However, the acoustic environment of the room had fundamentally altered. The phrase sounded significantly less like a formal legal objection and much more like a biological reflex desperately searching for a defensive wall that structurally no longer existed. Johnson did not even require the physical deployment of his raised finger for this specific interruption. He simply continued his reading sequence, maintaining the exact same controlled mechanical volume. From a tactical standpoint, this action was structurally more humiliating for the target. Actively defeating an interruption acknowledges the opponent's kinetic energy, but completely ignoring an interruption mathematically reduces the opponent to zero. Johnson proceeded to enter the secondary phase of the damage assessment into the permanent record. In exactly 7 of those 11 verified instances, the deliberately disclosed intelligence information subsequently appeared in foreign intelligence analytical products. The recorded temporal window for this transfer was strictly between 5 to 9 days following the initial media publication. This specific data point revealed the true mechanical consequence of the operation. The alleged intelligence leak did not simply terminate at the boundary of an American newspaper headline. It did not stop as a localized domestic political hit. The data actively traveled outward, bypassing the secure perimeter, moving rapidly through open media channels, and landing directly into the operational hands of foreign intelligence services. Those foreign entities could then formally cite Western media, reporting as their official source. Within the architecture of global espionage, this exact sequence functions as an operational laundering cycle, a mechanism explicitly designed to make classified structural damage appear as organic journalism after the fact. Speaker Johnson then isolated one highly specific chronological timeline to ensure the committee could not successfully hide behind the fog of abstraction. Coordinate 1, the 7th of March, 2018. The Intelligence Committee received a highly classified briefing focusing on a sensitive counterintelligence matter related directly to surveillance authorities. The physical attendance log confirmed the presence of Representative Schiff functioning as the ranking member alongside 6 other verified committee members. Coordinate 2, the 9th of March 2018. Exactly 72 hours after the classified data was presented, the Washington Post formally published an article. The D&I damage assessment explicitly identified the details contained within that specific article as being highly consistent with the restricted information presented inside the classified briefing, and strictly verified that those details were mathematically not available through any other public sources. Coordinate 3, the 16th of March, 2018. A verified foreign intelligence analytical product officially referenced that exact same restricted information. The foreign entity documented its acquisition by sourcing it directly to the open Western media reporting. If the intelligence assessment was factually accurate, this represented a flawlessly executed laundering cycle. It was structurally ugly in its mechanical efficiency and absolutely terrifying in its geopolitical consequences. Johnson audibly repeated the pattern for the room because the repetition was not a rhetorical device. The repetition mathematically belonged to the physical facts. Tuesday briefing, Thursday article. Next week, foreign pickup. 11 total iterations executed over 18 continuous months. That was the precise chronological coordinate when Speaker Johnson delivered the sentence that structurally reduced the entire multi-year leak allegation into a single, highly compressed phrase sharp enough to physically cut glass. That is not a leak, that is a schedule. This specific sentence landed within the room utilizing a completely different kinetic frequency than a standard accusation. Accusations inherently invite verbal denials, but descriptions simply sit motionless on the table and actively dare the occupants of the room to pretend they cannot physically observe what is positioned directly in front of them. Linguistically, the word leak simulates an environment that is chaotic, accidental, and completely messy. It describes the kind of physical anomaly that randomly slips from a pressurized system experiencing structural failure. However, the word schedule simulates an environment that is highly organized, fully expected, and almost entirely operational. And that was the exact structural point Johnson required to be permanently burned into the congressional hearing record. At that precise moment, the forensic zoom locks onto the target's physical perimeter. The pen resting on Schiff's table, which had been completely abandoned earlier when it ceased to be a useful mechanism for absorbing pressure, suddenly moved slightly. Regardless of whether the broadcast cameras caught the small physical roll cleanly or not, the mechanical image perfectly matched the room's structural understanding. A biological body was actively producing the physical evidence that the facial structure continued to refuse to authorize. For a biological subject who had constructed his entire operational existence upon a highly controlled voice, a meticulously controlled physical posture, and absolute controlled public certainty, the smallest uncontrolled mechanical movement functioned exactly like a silent confession transmitted directly from the furniture. Speaker Mike Johnson then executed a deliberate pivot in the operational audit. He transitioned the analytical lens away from the mechanics of public deception and focused it entirely on the mechanics of monetized deception. This specific shift fundamentally altered the atmospheric density of the hearing room. In the rigorous evaluation of political behavior, financial capital functions as a strict, quantifiable metric. It provides a mathematically precise measurement of exactly what a political operative believes a fabricated narrative is physically worth. The forensic audit isolated the exact chronological coordinate, the 21st of June, 2023. On this specific date, the United States House of Representatives executed a formal binding vote to officially censure Representative Adam Schiff. The physical document containing the censure resolution did not contain any structural flattery. It did not praise the biological subject for exhibiting courage. It did not utilize the vocabulary of martyrdom, nor did it frame him as a systemic victim actively punished for defending the parameters of democracy. The text of the document deployed highly controlled, rigid, institutional language. It explicitly stated that Representative Schiff had formally misled the American public and had actively engaged in conduct fundamentally unbecoming of an elected member of the House of Representatives. While that language is categorized as formal and institutional, it remains structurally unmistakable when mechanically translated into standard operational English. The behavioral scan of the event logs the exact physical reaction. Representative Schiff stood in the physical well of the House floor while allied Democratic operatives audibly shouted the word shame. The entire physical scene was instantly packaged and exported by his political network as an act of systemic persecution. They projected an optical illusion designed to suggest that the core moral question was simply whether Schiff possessed political enemies, rather than addressing the structural question of whether the physical accusations logged against him were factually true. Immediately following the deployment of the censure resolution, the administrative apparatus surrounding Representative Schiff activated a massive digital infrastructure. This system was highly engineered to extract financial capital from a specific demographic, small dollar donors. The network processed thousands of individual transactions in precise mathematical increments, people mechanically transmitting $20, $50, and $100. These specific biological subjects initiated these transfers because they operated under the calculated belief that they were financially rewarding an act of courage. They believe this because that is exactly what Schiff's digital fundraising operation explicitly programmed them to believe. Speaker Johnson executed the core forensic comparison of this phase. He physically placed the official censure resolution directly beside the digital fundraising emails. The structural contrast between the two texts was almost obscene in its absolute simplicity. The audit processes the text line by line. Document A, the official resolution, stated, misleading the American public. Document B, the fundraising email, stated, censured for standing up to Donald Trump. Document A, the official resolution, stated, conduct unbecoming of an elected member. Document B, the fundraising email, stated, punish for defending democracy. Document A referred to verified falsehoods, misrepresentations, and abuses of sensitive information. Document B instructed the financial donors that Representative Schiff had been systematically targeted by mega extremists for telling the truth. This specific conversion matrix represents the creation of a secondary structural lie built directly upon the exact foundation of the primary lie. The architecture is perfectly observable. If the original public claim broadcast on television was, I have seen physical evidence, the subsequent monetized version transmitted to the donor base was, the system punished me because I told the truth. Johnson's tactical line landed with maximum kinetic force because it mathematically reduced the entire sophisticated digital operation down to its absolute ugliest, rawest form. The generation of exactly $8.1 million extracted directly from a lie about a lie. The forensic zoom now returns its absolute focus to the physical perimeter of the target. By this advanced chronological point in the hearing, Representative Schiff's physical composure had mathematically reached a critical structural threshold. His state of calm had become overtly, painfully visible, precisely because the biological system was expending maximum kinetic energy in a desperate attempt to keep it invisible. At the initiation of the hearing, his projected calm registered as standard professional behavior. It could be categorized as perhaps slightly arrogant or highly rehearsed, but it remained firmly within the acceptable, familiar operational range of a veteran political operative who possessed the mechanical knowledge of how to survive a sequence of hostile questions. But now the physical stillness was far too perfect. The audit tracks the microscopic metrics. The ocular blinking rate was too heavily restrained. The respiratory cycle was too meticulously measured. The muscular arrangement of the face was too carefully locked into position. The highly engineered performance of not being worried had begun to mechanically broadcast the presence of severe internal worry at a significantly higher volume than any overt display of biological panic could have successfully achieved. This phenomenon exposes the strange mechanical weakness of severe over-control. It does not possess the structural capacity to successfully mask internal stress indefinitely. Eventually, the internal pressure algorithm systematically outlines the stress in significantly cleaner, sharper lines, functioning exactly like physical chalk drawn around a biological body at a secure crime scene. The mahogany witness table ceased to function as a standard piece of committee furniture. It had structurally mutated into a sealed, transparent display case. And Representative Schiff was now physically trapped inside that perimeter, securely locked alongside his own acoustic words, his own financial fundraising language, his own internal staff communications, and a highly classified briefing transcript that permanently refused to stay buried. Speaker Mike Johnson finally arrived at the terminal analytical question of the proceeding. This was the specific, unavoidable query that had systematically tracked Representative Adam Schiff across every illuminated television studio, every published media headline, every self-righteous broadcast interview, every digital donor email, and every single moral lecture he had ever delivered under the protective shield of a federal title. Johnson established the structural parameters of intelligence oversight. He entered a massive mathematical variable into the record. 330 million American citizens fundamentally lacked the security clearance required to read the classified material. This massive demographic could not physically sit inside the secure briefing rooms, and they mathematically could not test the physical evidence for themselves. That extreme informational asymmetry is exactly why Representative Schiff's position carried such devastating structural weight. In the mechanical operation of intelligence oversight, blind trust functions as the primary currency. The American public was structurally forced to take Schiff's acoustic word because he actively possessed the security clearance, he possessed the committee chairmanship, and he possessed the exclusive access. The audit confirms that Schiff weaponized all three of those specific variables as a verified credential every single time he looked directly into a broadcast camera and explicitly told the country he had visually seen what they physically could not see. Therefore, Johnson methodically stripped the entire matter down to the single, isolated question remaining on the table. He bypassed the abstract metrics. The question was no longer whether Schiff personally felt vindicated. It was no longer whether the theoretical arc of history would judge him kindly. It was no longer whether highly partisan television viewers still maintained a positive emotional baseline toward him. The terminal question was strictly physical. Could the tangible physical evidence he repeatedly claimed to possess be produced inside that specific room? Show it, Johnson stated in substance. He issued a direct mechanical command. Show the physical committee the verified evidence of Russian collusion that the Robert Mueller apparatus completely failed to establish. Show the evidence that the John Durham investigation mathematically did not find. Show the evidence that Inspector General Horowitz did not validate. And most critically, show the physical evidence that the United States intelligence community explicitly told Representative Schiff in a classified vault had not been corroborated. The acoustic space within the hearing room instantly collapsed. The silence that immediately followed this command was not theatrical in nature. Within the parameters of human behavior, theater inherently requires kinetic movement. This specific event was the absolute physical opposite of movement. It was kinetic zero. 5 chronological seconds passed, then 6 seconds, then 7 seconds. The physical dimensions of the room did not generate loud acoustic output. Instead, the atmospheric pressure structurally altered. The space mathematically became smaller, significantly tighter, and terrifyingly exact. It simulated a physical environment where the structural walls had actively leaned inward to monitor whether Adam Schiff could successfully produce the single physical object around which he had engineered 6 continuous years of absolute public certainty. By the 10-second mark, the terminal answer was already fully forming in the air. It was not forming in the shape of acoustic words, but rather in the absolute crushing absence of words. Because the behavioral algorithms dictate that when a biological subject has expended multiple years publicly stating they possess physical evidence and then systematically fails to name or produce that object, when finally placed under direct pressure, their silence mathematically stops being neutral. By the 15-second mark, the silence had structurally mutated. The silence itself had become the primary physical exhibit. The target's fixed, unblinking ocular stare had become the official response. Representative Schiff's highly engineered composure had finally reached the critical threshold, where it no longer projected the optical illusion of control. It simply looked exactly like a mechanical operating system that had completely frozen because every single available escape route on the motherboard had been systematically closed. Johnson did not need to deploy verbal insults. He did not need to physically pound his fists against the mahogany desk. He did not need to wave the classified transcript violently in the air. The terminal question had successfully executed the exact function that properly engineered questions are designed to execute. It physically exposed the missing object. Schiff's eyes remained locked open, mechanically fixed on the speaker. But the visual output did not register as command. It did not register as contempt. It did not even register as the highly familiar television confidence that had successfully carried his biological body through years of friendly broadcast interviews. It was the vacant, static stare of a biological subject encountering a physical request that mathematically could not be answered with a list of credentials. It could not be dodged by simulating moral outrage. It could not be buried underneath abstract references to democracy, institutional duty, President Trump, Russia, January 6th, or the sacred burden of public service. The command asked exclusively for a physical object, not atmospheric fog, not operational suspicion, not moral posture. And because that physical object mathematically failed to appear, because zero documents moved forward, and because absolutely no proof landed on the table beside Johnson's binder, the 15-second void completed the prosecution's argument far more cleanly than any acoustic speech could have ever achieved. Speaker Johnson deployed his final verbal sequence. He stated quietly that Representative Schiff could not physically show it because the object mathematically did not exist. The extreme quietness of Johnson's acoustic delivery made the sentence structurally devastating. Overt cruelty would have provided Schiff with kinetic energy to initiate a fight. But the quiet, analytical sadness simply left the target standing motionless next to the massive, empty physical space where his evidence was mathematically supposed to be. Johnson manually closed the heavy binder, executing the action with the calm, mechanical finality of an instructor, terminating a lesson that structurally should never have been necessary. He drew a final comparative metric, comparing the operational matter to a student actively cheating on an examination, and then loudly informing the rest of the class that the test itself was unfair. Schiff had told the American population he possessed the evidence, was physically caught without it, rapidly converted the subsequent consequences into a digital fundraising pitch, and informed his donors he was being punished for courage. That was not a mistake, Johnson's framing dictated. That was a career. No further questions, Johnson stated. He closed the binder completely. He placed his pen securely into the spine. The acoustic sound of paper and plastic snapping together executed the exact function that cable television panels had systematically refused to do for multiple years. It forced the operation to physically stop talking. Outside the geographical perimeter of Washington, the data was processed with brutal efficiency. A biological subject named Gerald Thibodeau, operating from a bait shop in Louisiana, processed the raw video feed and reduced the entire multi-year intelligence operation into a flawless structural metaphor. A man who says he caught a 1-2-pound bass had better have the fish in the cooler, Thibodeau noted. Representative Schiff had broadcast to the American population for 6 continuous years that he had secured the biggest catch in the history of national politics. He transmitted this data on every available frequency. He commanded the public to visually admire the catch long before anyone was permitted to open the lid. Speaker Mike Johnson simply walked up and physically opened the cooler. It was absolutely empty. And the terminal devastation was not simply the absence of the fish, it was the verified classified transcript proving that Representative Schiff possessed absolute prior knowledge that the cooler was empty the entire time he was speaking into the cameras. Following the crushing physical weight of the 15-second void, Representative Adam Schiff finally initiated his acoustic response. The forensic timeline verifies that his verbal output lasted exactly 2 minutes and 31 seconds. Because the biological subject is a highly skilled mechanical speaker, the acoustic delivery sounded polished, operating precisely in the specific frequency where a legally losing closing argument can successfully simulate the optical illusion of polish. He utilized his broadcast time to mention partisan motivations. He actively questioned the structural integrity of the Durham Report. He leaned heavily upon the theoretical concept that future history would judge his actions more favorably, and he stated that the intelligence community's internal assessments had organically evolved over time. The forensic audit categorizes this specific 2-minute sequence not as a factual rebuttal, but as the deployment of broad atmospheric fog. It functioned as an acoustic filler engineered to consume television airtime, but it possessed absolutely zero kinetic force. It mathematically could not move a single physical document off the mahogany table. Schiff stated for the record that he stood by everything he had publicly said. While that specific line might have successfully stirred positive acoustic applause within a friendly, insulated television studio, inside that specific hearing room, it structurally sounded like a man desperately clinging to a marketing slogan long after the physical receipt had already been printed. The audit explicitly notes that what Schiff mathematically refused to address was significantly louder than the syllables he actually generated. His acoustic output completely bypassed the February 2018 briefing language. He ignored the 6-month chronological gap preceding the CBS claim. He evaded the internal staff email regarding video clips outrunning factual corrections. He bypassed the donor emails that structurally reframed his formal censure. He ignored the mechanical leak schedule, and he completely ignored the foreign intelligence pickup. Most critically, he entirely bypassed the basic physical demand to simply show the evidence. The rebuttal was not a defense. It was a mechanical delay tactic wearing a customized suit, operating on the desperate calculation that if enough syllables marched past the camera lens, the viewing population might mathematically mistake acoustic motion for a structural defense. Speaker Mike Johnson did not exhibit any physiological reaction. Providing a reaction would have structurally reduced the monumental event into a mere conversational exchange, and Johnson had already successfully converted it into a permanent, unalterable record. He stood up from the table. He carefully, mechanically buttoned his suit jacket, and he physically evacuated the room without executing a single backward optical scan toward Representative Schiff. That specific physical departure functioned as its own unique classification of punctuation. It was completely cold, not because it was engineered to be theatrical, but precisely because it mathematically refused to reward Schiff's final theatrical performance with another kinetic round. Almost immediately, the digital architecture of the external media ecosystem began to violently process the structural fragments of the hearing. 4 highly specific video clips exploded across the network. The first clip contained the briefing transcript colliding directly against the CBS broadcast statement. It was exactly 17 seconds of classified reality, violently striking public certainty. The contrast traveled with maximum velocity because the sequence was mathematically simple enough for any viewer to process. The subject was explicitly told one thing inside a classified room and subsequently told the American population the exact opposite on television. The second clip contained the sentence, "The clip travels before the correction." This specific data point bypassed standard political boundaries and cut directly into the media ecosystem because it explicitly exposed the core business model operating underneath the scandal. The phrase instantly became the universal shorthand for the entire structural method. Broadcast the claim first, let the viewing audience process the emotion, allow the video to harden into physical belief, and then ensure the factual correction arrives too late and too technically to possess any kinetic impact. The third clip exposed the financial conversion engine, placing the formal censure resolution directly beside the digital donor email. The fourth clip contained the terminal phrase, "That is not a leak, that is a schedule." Within the highly classified intelligence community, that specific phrase landed with a terrifying classification of force because biological subjects who physically operate around classified material mathematically understand exactly how lethal a pattern becomes once it permanently stops looking accidental. The subsequent consequences were not merely reputational, they were violently structural. The hearing did not simply bruise an optical image, it actively severed the institutional authority that had powered the image in the first place. The United States Senate explicitly denied Schiff a physical seat on the Intelligence Committee, permanently severing the political brand from its classified source code. Simultaneously, a formal criminal referral began moving through the mechanical architecture of the Department of Justice. The referral contained the leak allegations, the whistleblower testimony, the verified FBI 302, and the official damage assessment. The institutional media apparatus also initiated quiet, mechanical retreats. CNN formally issued an editor's note acknowledging a structural failure in their verification process. MSNBC executed a silent digital purge, quietly removing dozens of specific clips from their archives. The physical publication of Schiff's book, heavily built upon the narrative of his own vindication, suddenly resembled a monument physically erected directly over an empty vault. But to measure the ultimate structural damage, the forensic zoom must pull back from Washington entirely. In the state of Ohio, a biological subject named Crystal Atkins processed the deeper, permanent casualty of the operation. The damage survives long after the video clips physically fade from the network servers. When a political operative executes a lie regarding financial capital, the precise injury can be mathematically counted. When an operative simulates emotional concern, the optical hypocrisy can be easily named. But when a biological subject possessing elite, privileged intelligence access utilizes a broadcast camera to tell millions of citizens that hidden physical evidence exists and subsequently cannot produce it, the structural damage rapidly spreads into the public's absolute ability to believe the very next operative who claims they possess proof. That is the true terminal cost. It is not merely the $8.1 million extracted from donors. It is not the lost committee seat. It is the total volume of public trust systematically burned up inside the massive furnace of a manufactured narrative. The manufactured clip successfully traveled before the correction, but inside that specific hearing room, the physical correction finally arrived at the terminal. It was chronologically late, it was structurally hard, it was heavily documented, and it was mathematically impossible to flatter into something else. Representative Adam Schiff entered the room armed with 6 years of unverified broadcast claims. Speaker Mike Johnson entered the room armed with a physical binder. The final equation was absolute. 6 years of acoustic certainty was permanently annihilated by 15 seconds of verified physical silence.